Octavian's new name, Augustus, was two things at the same time. First, it was a victory prize, a title that he earned after defeating all his rivals to power and laid claim to the sole rule of the Roman Empire. But the name also signified Augustus's new job. He was now personally responsible for the preservation of this newly won peace. The chaos of the late Republic was both a cause and effect of impiety. The Romans had grown lax in their worship and committed grievous sins according to Augustus. And so Rome needed a revival. It needed an anointed one. It needed a Messiah. How did Augustus convince the Romans to place him at the center of a major religious reformation? Find out on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 7, The Roman Messiah. Before we begin, I'd just like to announce that in a couple of weeks, on September 22nd, 2023, I'll be doing an Ask Me Anything, AMA, on the Ask Historians Reddit page. This is a page with 1.9 million subscribers, and if listeners to this podcast have a Reddit account, you're more than welcome to go to the Ask Historians Reddit on the 22nd. The Ask Me Anything will be right at the top of the page, reddit.com, and just search for Ask Historians. And you can ask me any question you like about the Roman Empire, its economy, pandemics, insurrections, counterfactual histories, just about any question you want, and I'm going to be answering those questions all day. All right, let's get to the episode. In 29 BC, Augustus, who at that point was still called Octavian, decided to slam shut the double doors of the ancient temple to the god Janus. It was the first time in over 200 years that the doors of one of Rome's oldest temples had been shut. Why does this matter for our story? Well, in the last episode, I said that one of the titles awarded to Octavian was the Prince of Peace. The reason the doors of Janus had been opened for so long was because the city of Rome had been constantly at war since the end of the First Punic War several centuries before the age of Augustus. And only when Rome was completely at peace could those doors be shut. And so by ordering those gates to be closed, Octavian put Rome on notice. A new era of peace had begun. The year after that, in 28 BC, Octavian became Augustus, as you know from the last episode. And Augustus claimed that peace could be secured by restoring proper worship of the gods. Now, this argument made sense to the Romans. It was a common view that any kind of malady or misfortune, whether it was personal or whether it was political, whether it was an epidemic or something like a bad harvest, any kind of calamity like this was due to some degree of impiety. So some god somewhere was angry and needed to be placated. The years of broad social unrest, the murders in the city of Rome, the civil wars that crisscrossed the empire, these obviously, to the Romans at least, must have been caused by some tremendous amount of collective transgression. And while Augustus no doubt probably believed this in part to be true, he was a Roman, he had the same religious views as his contemporaries, he was also shifting blame. Because of course, the calamities of the past few decades were not just random acts of God. It had been him that had helped assemble the kill lists. He had marched an army on Rome. He had fought several battles in civil wars in which he ordered his own soldiers to kill tens of thousands of their own countrymen. But now Augustus was using some sleight of hand, you might say, to blame the chaos that preceded his rule as Romans neglecting their duties to the gods. And as Rome's new representative, he would lead the Romans into righteousness and the fruits of peace and prosperity. These things would surely follow. Now, there were several ways that Augustus would lay claim to being Rome's anointed savior. Really, he could do three things. He could win wars, he could build temples, and he could restore traditional morality. So let's start with the first one. Roman gods, like all gods, can't be seen, but it was possible to see their approval when the Romans had victories in foreign wars. And not long after the doors of the Temple of Janus were closed, Augustus sent soldiers off on various expeditions in search of foreign armies to destroy. And one such Roman force, led by the brand new governor of Egypt, marched down the Nile all the way into the ancient region of Ethiopia. Now, sources don't really tell us exactly what that army accomplished, but Augustus offers a few vague claims in his res gestae, in his record of the things that he accomplished in his life. He says this: very large forces of the enemy were cut to pieces in battle, and many towns were captured. That's Augustus in his res gestae. What's most interesting about this episode, which is basically a historical footnote, it's not really mentioned much, is really what happened afterwards. So some victory was achieved. Again, we don't know how great it was. Seems to have been fairly minor. But the governor who actually led the armies, because Augustus was back in Rome, that governor decided to commemorate his achievements by erecting some monuments to himself in Egypt. Now, this kind of self-exaltation was pretty common in the late Republic. It was very normal for elite generals to brag about their victories. But this governor obviously hadn't gotten the memo. In this new regime, personal glorification was reserved for the emperor only. And before this governor knew it, he was recalled back to Rome, where he was put on trial and then forced to commit suicide in disgrace. It was Augustus's job and no one else's to claim victory, because it was his job to restore the favor of Rome's angry gods. Augustus would try to get an even larger victory a few years later. The replacement governor of Egypt was given an army and an even grander mission. He was going to sneak that army into Persia. He was going to defeat Rome's greatest rival, the Parthian Empire, and then he was going to recapture a set of Roman battle standards, which had been lost in Persia about 2.5 decades earlier. And according to plan, that army launched out of Egypt, but the governor leading them wrongly believed that if they marched down the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula, that this would get them into Persia in a kind of stealthy way. But what the governor didn't realize, of course, is that the Arabian Peninsula was basically desert and dead-ended into the sea. So after about a year, they captured a few towns, but accomplished really nothing of any significance. Certainly didn't make it to Persia. It was geographically impossible for them to do that. The army eventually had to retreat in shame back into Roman territory. Now, Augustus, again in the Res Gestae, would still claim that this expedition was a victory, but many Romans probably began to have their doubts at this point as to whether Augustus truly was the kind of messianic figure that he was claiming to be. Now, in the end, Augustus became so desperate for an overwhelming military victory that he essentially manufactured one. And fortunately for him, he had a little bit of help. Let me lay this out for you. The Armenians, which are the peoples just to the west of Persia on the Roman border, they were allies with Rome at this time. They aren't always allies with Rome. In fact, they tend to shift back and forth, allying with whoever's in control of Persia. And the Armenians had been able to kidnap one of the sons of the Parthian king. And in 23 BC, Augustus sent a message to the Parthian king saying that he could get that boy sent back to them in exchange for those captured military standards that he had tried to get with that doomed expedition into Arabia. The Parthian king agreed to this. Obviously, he wanted his son back. And so Augustus went ahead and sent the boy to Parthia. But then the Parthian king maybe had some second thoughts or just delayed things, and several years went by and nothing had happened. And Augustus was really starting to look foolish at this point. But then either him or maybe one of his advisors figured out how to make lemonade out of lemons. And what Augustus did is he, along with his leading general Agrippa and his son-in-law Tiberius, all took an army and began marching it towards Persia. Well, the Parthian ruler of Persia obviously got the message and didn't want to mess with an army. And after all, he did kind of agree to give up the military standards. This obviously made him find his sense of urgency. He sent Augustus the military standards and also, as a bonus, a little bit of wealth. And there were some prisoners of war that had been captured along with the military standards that had been in Persia for nearly 25 years. And all of these were recovered and brought back to Rome. So now Augustus had the victory that he was looking for. Although no battle was actually fought, still he milked the thing for all that it was worth. He had his proof that the gods were smiling on his regime. Coins flooded Rome with images of a kneeling Parthian, sheepishly handing over the Roman legionary standards. And you can look in the show notes for a link to that coin. Augustus also used the victory as a reason to build a new temple to the god Mars. This is the god of war. But Augustus emphasized that Mars was also an avenger, and that he had helped Augustus avenge the Romans on their old foe, Parthia. Now, I mention this temple because it really epitomizes the way that Augustus so cleverly rehabilitated his dark past. Because although Augustus began building that temple after these legionary standards and prisoners of war were returned, that's not actually the beginning of this temple story. It was after the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. That was the battle, if you remember, where Brutus and Cassius, the last of the assassins of Julius Caesar, were finally killed. It was actually after that battle that Augustus, then called Octavian, had made a vow to Mars the Avenger, thanking him for ensuring that Brutus and Cassius were killed. And the temple was dedicated in gratitude for that action. But now, during the new reign of this new man Augustus, those dark days were meant to be forgotten, and the temple was repurposed, like so much else in the Augustan regime. The temple of Mars the Avenger was just one of over 80 temples that Augustus constructed, rebuilt, or repaired. Now, some of those temples were to Rome's traditional gods and goddesses, but quite a few of them, like the Temple of Mars the Avenger, were temples honoring deities that were personally associated with Augustus in some way. One of the gods that Augustus especially exalted was the Greek god Apollo. Augustus claimed that Apollo was his personal protector, and he would build 4 temples to that deity. And the largest of those was a massive structure on Rome's Palatine Hill, the place where many of Rome's wealthiest citizens lived. And that temple would end up taking over many of the functions of other temples, making it a kind of ritualistic and religious center in the city of Rome. Okay, enough about temples, especially on a podcast when you can't see them. Although I have to say, neither can we, because Augustus's temples were adorned with all sorts of valuable materials, gold and marble and fine statues. And so this made them ripe for pillaging as the empire went into decline centuries later. And so we only actually know what many of these temples looked like because Augustus so wanted everybody to know about his temple building program and the favor that it produced that he minted coins with images of some of these temples on them. And that's how we actually know what they look like. Okay, so that's two of the ways that Augustus placed himself in the center of Roman religion. What about the third way? Well, restoring morality was not like building temples, okay? This third prong of Augustus's religious reforms was really the most difficult, and it ended up being the most unpopular. And it was, of course, bound to be. I don't think any government on planet Earth has yet figured out how to actually reform the human heart. Laws can compel behavior, but usually only skin deep. Augustus would try, though. Oh boy, did he try. And so in 18 BC and 17 BC, Augustus used the Senate to push through a series of laws aimed at reforming the bad behavior of Rome's upper classes, especially members of the Senate. The logic here is pretty simple. These were the men that all Romans were meant to look up to. They were the examples. And so if Rome was to get its moral house in order and please the gods, it needed to start with the Senate. What kind of bad behavior are we talking about here? Well, by the end of the Republic, elite Romans were constantly divorcing and remarrying. They were regularly committing adultery. And of course, the consequences of this was that they had broods of illegitimate children. The laws that Augustus pushed through the Senate were aimed at addressing those sorts of problems. For example, they restricted senators from marrying members of Rome's lower classes. And the more legitimate children a senator had, the laws would give that senator preference for higher political offices and various honors and titles. The laws also had some prohibitions. Unmarried men and unmarried women were banned from participating in Rome's public festivals. That doesn't just mean like staying home from a party. These festivals were where Rome's elites displayed their wealth and their status. And so to be banned from these very public, hierarchy-driven displays was absolutely devastating. And Rome's senators, if they wanted to advance in their careers, needed now to get married, they needed to stay married, and they needed to have lots of kids with their wife. And extramarital affairs, those were banned entirely. This aspect of the moral reforms was the most deeply unpopular part of the entire package of laws. Roman elite men basically viewed sleeping around as a kind of traditional pastime. But under the new laws, adulterous couples would be exiled from the city and then banished to separate islands in the Mediterranean. Their property could even be taken from them. Even as the senators openly questioned this part of the legislation, Augustus was willing to show that he was serious. He was so serious that when his own daughter committed adultery in 2 BC, he had her exiled. He had to do the same thing to his granddaughter. And she was also exiled for adultery about 10 years after her mother was. So it really is like what I said before. Augustus probably believed his own propaganda. He took what he was doing seriously. It wasn't like it was just a cynical plot. He saw himself as Rome's savior. But the moral legislation also had a purpose that Augustus would have wanted to remain unspoken. The fact was that Augustus, when he was triumvir, had ordered the murder of thousands of elites, and perhaps as many as half of the Roman Senate. So obviously, elites were in short supply. Rewarding marriage between senators and legitimate senatorial children and penalizing adultery helped to kickstart the restoration of the upper class that Augustus, back when he was Octavian, had more than decimated. But the pinnacle of Augustus's propaganda had to be a massive 3-day festival that he held in 16 BC. That was called the Secular Games. Now, I don't want you to be confused. Secular here does not mean the same thing that it means in the English language, like worldly or non-religious. In fact, Quite the opposite. Secular refers to a sacred period of time, which the Romans call a saeculum. It's the amount of time which it took for the population of the world to completely refresh itself. Basically, it's the longest period of time that a person could possibly live, which for the Romans was believed to be about 100 years or 110 years, something like that. And so a new saeculum was like a new age. It was a new world, a new beginning. And this was obviously a concept that Augustus could use for his propaganda campaign. Augustus made his secular games in 16 BC a huge deal, boasting that his reign had brought the Roman Empire into a new golden age. And he used the secular games to further promote his temple building program and his moral legislation. So, having a prominent role in the festivities were married men and women and mothers and upper-class children. These people were formed into little groups where they sang songs, they offered sacrifices, there were a bunch of different parades and processions through different parts of the city. It was clearly seen as the highest honor to participate in the festivities of the secular games. And elite Romans took the opportunity to flatter Augustus, hoping to earn prominent roles in the festivities. Now, one of these flatterers was a poet named Horace. And Horace wrote a hymn for the games. And listen to just a few lines of this and ask yourself, what is it that the lines are praising? Goddess, make strong our youth and bless the Senate's decrees, rewarding parenthood and marriage, that from the new laws Rome may heap a lavish harvest of boys and girls. That's Horace's secular hymn. Okay, Augustus isn't mentioned in the hymn, certainly not by name. This is Horace pushing Augustus's moral legislation, which was unpopular, to try to get people to buy in to the message of the regime. Horace, in fact, wrote many poems that glorified Augustus and urged people to see him as the restorer of Roman virtue. We see a reference, for example, to the temple building program in this poem. Quote, "You shall expiate undeserved the crimes of your ancestors, Roman, until you restore the temples and collapsing shrines of the gods and images begrimed with black smoke." That's Horace's Odes. Here he assigns Augustus the power to expiate transgressions against the gods by constructing or rebuilding temples. Some of these artists, like the senators, they too had become slaves to power. Another of these artists was the poet Virgil, and he composed an epic poem called the Aeneid, which connected the Augustan regime to Rome's founding mythology. At one point in the poem, the story's protagonist and titular character, a man named Aeneas, who was one of the survivors of the Trojan War and one of the founders of Rome, he has a vision in the poem, and he sees the future. And what I'm about to read is the culmination of that vision. Quote, "This is the man, this one, of whom so often you have heard the promise, Caesar Augustus, son of the god, who shall bring once again an age of gold to Latium, to the land where Saturn reigned in early times. He will extend his power beyond Africa and India, over far territories, north and south." That's Virgil's Aeneid. The submission to Augustan ideology among poets and writers and other artists shows the degree to which Augustus was more than just a political figure. He became an object of worship in his own right. Eventually, some of the inhabitants of Rome's provinces even erected temples to Augustus while he was still alive. He received priests. Sacrifices were made to his divine spirit. But, there were also some cracks in the facade of Augustus's ideology. And I want to highlight some of those in the next episode. Racy poems that undermined the new morality, huge military blunders, and perhaps most strange and scandalous, a series of dead successors. Augustus may have accomplished total power, but he wasn't really a god. He was going to die, and despite his best efforts to find a worthy heir to pass on his power, each of his selections kept mysteriously dying. Historians have different theories about these convenient accidents, but some of the oldest sources pin the deaths and what appears to have been a quiet coup on Augustus's closest companion, his wife. We'll talk about this ancient conspiracy theory on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.